What happens when one man tries to watch all the sci-fi films of the 1980s? We're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the 80s Project, Sci-Fi 81. As compared to 1980, there was quite a bit more sci-fi in 1981. Although I have to say that the quality was a little shakier. In this block, though, there's a really interesting mix ranging from Disney superheroes to some bitchin' in the kitchen. So let's just jump straight into the summer of 81. To kick this one off, we're going back ever so slightly to July 11th, and we're headed to Japan for School in the Crosshairs. And it looks like it also had the title The Aimed School. It's set at a school with a young girl named Yuka and a very excitable teacher.
受験に必要なものはまず第一にその健全なる体でしょう
And Yuka has a reputation for being the smartest kid in class, which makes some people dance, and everyone just loves her. She also discovers that she possesses powers and reverses time to save a small child from being run over. She also has a guy friend who has a pet monkey, and really, I would love a pet monkey, but I also like having my face not torn off. She eventually uses her powers to help Seiki win his tournament, which isn't really the most heroic thing to do. Like, isn't that cheating, really? But interestingly, the movie actually addresses that. But then she notices a strange man watching her and exhibits magical powers and tells her that she could rule the world if she wished. But then things get weird when a new girl arrives at school and she has powers of her own and immediately has beef with Yuka. Pretty soon, she's creating these fascist-style school patrols, all in matching uniforms, and rounding up any students they consider to be exhibiting bad behavior, with things escalating to the evil girl showing up in a red leotard to attack the gym teacher. And every time that she uses her powers, it's represented by everything turning gray. And if this seems a little oddball and surreal, consider that it's from Nobuhiko Obayashi, the director of the infamous House. You may have heard of that one as Hausu, as it's often referred to, probably to avoid confusion with the Steve Miner film, but it's his most revered work, and if you haven't seen it, then you haven't seen one of the weirdest films of all time. He did this one shortly afterwards, and you can see some of his trademark eccentricities in it, mainly in the experimental visuals going on, even if the plot itself is more straightforward. It's definitely a message movie since it's about the rise of fascism and how easily people can get wrapped up in a charismatic dictator just on a school level. And it's an example of what's referred to in Japan as an idol movie. Basically, when a young actor becomes super famous really quickly, and a movie is made to basically promote them as a person as much as possible to broaden their appeal, as opposed to an actor playing a role as a character. It's simply them being themselves, more or less, which really isn't that different than what's done everywhere, but they just have a name for it and acknowledge it. By the ending, it's gone full weird with space battles and an overdose of low-grade and awesome effects and people trapped in stars. And I give this one 3.5 tapes. It's got a lot of good stuff going on. It's a bit muddled as far as the story goes, and it gets a little all over the place, but it's charming, and it has a heart, and I enjoyed it. Its sci-fi cultural significance is low at a 1.5, but keep in mind that's for us here in the US. It had more impact in Japan, but here it's very little known and a bit unsung. Should you watch it? Yeah, it's worth it. Put it in your crosshairs.
Yuka, 俺がついてる私は言ったが欲しいお前の言ったことをもう一度よーく考えて
We're headed to August 7th here and the premiere of Condor Man. which has Woody Wilkins here in a Condor Man outfit ready to fly, while Teen Wolf's dad takes pictures. His flight doesn't go so well, and we find out that he's not exactly a superhero. He's a comic book artist who is obsessed with making a real, working suit. See, he's so committed to having his book be realistic. He doesn't want to have his character do anything that's not feasible in real life. Harry is actually a low-level member of the CIA, and he has to choose a civilian to do a simple drop, and he decides to enlist Woody. He excitedly agrees and meets up with his contact, a Bond girl, although she's not what she seems, as she's working for either Dr. Heckle or Mr. Hyde. Word of Condor Man as a secret agent starts to spread, so they need Woody's help, and he reluctantly agrees so that he can meet back up with Natalia. And this was a live-action venture from Disney, who were having a bit of a rough time in 1981 with live action. They had just had a couple of busts in a row, including Dragon Slayer, so they were hoping a wacky superhero spy flick could turn things around. It was based on a book called The Game of X that was a bit more adult-oriented than their regular fare, and the film was considered a touch more risque than normal, which is funny to think about when you watch it now, because it's super tame. But apparently, Barbara Bach's sexiness was just too much to contain. Charles Jarrett was brought on to direct, and he'd been in the business since the 60s, and had even won a Golden Globe in 1970 for Anne of the Thousand Days. He wasn't really known for lighthearted comedy, though, so this was a bit out of his normal scope. It's far less a superhero story than you would think, and for a good chunk, feels like a James Bond spoof with disguises and gadgets and cool cars and the Condor Mobile, which I used to have Hot Wheels of, I think, but I looked it up, and it seems like it didn't exist, but I could really swear I had a toy version of this, but I guess I just imagined it. The budget wasn't crazy, but it did cost $14 million, which was a decent size. I mean, Dragon Slayer, which looked a good deal more expensive, only cost $18 million, so it certainly wasn't on the cheap. Unfortunately, it was met with some pretty negative reviews, with people calling it dull and uninteresting. That translated into lack of interest at the ticket booths as well, making only around $5 million, marking it as a flop. But it's since developed a decent-sized cult following, especially with Disney fans. Because of that, there's been minor nods to the characters in some Disney products, including his wings appearing in the Disney Infinity series of games, and an appearance in toy form in one of the Toy Story short films. I guess I should point out that he only appears in the Condor Man uniform in the last 10 minutes or so of the movie, and everything before that is low-grade spy stuff, so if you're expecting a winged superhero adventure, you're gonna be disappointed. And my rating is a 3, because yeah, color me disappointed. I had fond memories of this from a long time ago, but I haven't seen it since, and it really didn't hold up to my memory. It's still kind of fun, but just not that much. Its significance is a 2.5, since it's kind of well remembered, but not that much. It's still just a cult thing. Should you watch it? Yeah, it's worth a watch. It's still a good time, just kind of forgettable.
Who can save the city? Who? Who? This is a job for Condor Man!
Next up, we head to September 8th for Firebird 2015 AD, and it's set in the far-off future of 2015. And it seems like gasoline is in tight supply, only being supplied to the authority figures. Ralphie's dad is here, and he's something called a burner, who is someone who defies the government order and continues to drive a car. The group hunting them down are the DVC, the Department of Vehicle Control. Red has a son named Cam, and they have a strained relationship, but he also has a glorious Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. And man, I'm getting the Last Chase vibes again here. Is that like a future where gas is rationed out, drivers not allowed, one man decides to take his souped-up car out with a younger man as his passenger. They even feature an actor in common with George Touliatos. Where's Burgess Meredith and his airplane? Instead, we get Doug McClure, as part of the DVC. But one of their number has gone a bit over the edge and is just blowing burners up, which causes dissension in the ranks, while young Cam flirts with another burner named Jill, sparking his interest in cars. And this was directed by David Robertson, who has had a pretty unique career. He's only directed 4 things in the span of a decade, with this being his first feature, and then did an anthology segment in '86, and then 2 TV movies. But outside of directing, he has a huge filmography of doing other work, including a solid number of first assistant director roles and production manager jobs. He worked on some big-name horror classics like the original Black Christmas, Friday the 13th Part 5, and Return of the Living Dead. And there's a weird focus on Dad getting his son laid, and also a strange number of musical interludes.
Stay with you a while. I was blind before I met you.
And this was a Canadian venture, and although it debuted on the 8th in the US in Wisconsin, it then went to the Canadian market a little more than a week later on the 18th. It wasn't very warmly received and didn't really make any sort of impact on the market, and ended up on a couple of worst movies of all time lists, although I'm gonna question those lists if this is there, since it's not really that terrible. In fact, my rating on it is a 2, which I know isn't great, but hardly one of the worst ever. It's just kinda dull and doesn't do much with its runtime. Its significance is a 1.5 since it's all but forgotten, didn't make a splash, but does have some recognizable faces. Should you watch it? I guess if you're really into cars, maybe?
Oh boy, Tilly, I'm going to take this young man out and teach him the facts of life. Will you? Thank you.
Come on, you.
But Dad! And don't come back until you learn them.
One day after that Canadian release, on September 19th in Canada, there was the premiere of Threshold. It didn't get a US release until much later though, not arriving here until 1983. It starts with an overhead shot of LA and whoa, this giant empty space here is now the home of a massive hotel, the LA Grand, which is just kind of weird to see it open like that. And then there's this big open spot, and damn, that's now a massive apartment complex. And this whole area back here is completely different. Like just weird how much downtown has changed since then, but I guess it's been 40 years, so yeah. We meet Dr. President Snow, and Mayor Ebert is one of his patients, and he's approached by a former one, played by Mare Winningham. His wife is Sharon Acker, who we just saw not that long ago in Happy Birthday to Me, and when Doc Verrain goes to a heart transplant conference, he runs into Seth Brundle, and they discuss the concept of doing an artificial heart. And an interesting thing to mention is that this film takes place before a successfully transplanted artificial heart had been done. That didn't happen until 1982, and that's why you may be sitting there and looking at this film and saying, this doesn't seem like a science fiction film, as it's kind of just like a medical drama. But it's actually the core definition of science fiction, taking a scientific principle and expanding upon it and elaborating to make a fictional tale. When they were making this film, an actual heart transplant, an artificial one, was a fictional concept, just one that was rendered shortly reality. So, when it looks like there's no other options for Carol, they decide to go ahead with the artificial heart and have her become the first human with one. And the director here was Richard Pierce, who had previously done some TV stuff and one other film, but would go on to a pretty long and eclectic career, including the Steve Martin film Leap of Faith. He seems to have more or less retired from directing, but still does producing work and cinematography, including the Oscar-nominated documentary Food, Inc. Threshold was a Canadian production, and even though it's set in the US, was filmed almost entirely in Ottawa, with a budget of around 5 million Canadian, and went on to be pretty highly acclaimed. It was nominated for 10 Genie Awards, the Canadian equivalent of the Oscars, and won 2 of them. Donald Sutherland took the Best Actor award, and it also took Best Cinematography, but lost out on the Best Picture one to The Gray Fox. Minor note, but Sutherland and Goldblum had already worked together previously 3 years earlier in the Invasion of the Body Snatchers remake. And yeah, if your view of science fiction is lasers and spaceships, you may be disappointed by this, since it's mostly pretty dramatic. But I thought it was a pretty cool thing to include a film that was considered science fiction at the time, and now it's just a film about a technology that's, well, I mean, not commonplace, but now exists. And I give it a 3, since I find it pretty interesting and the performances are just top-notch, but the story itself is pretty dry, and for a drama, it's not really that dramatic. Its significance is a 2.5 since it's not spoken about much, but did win awards and has some top talent in it, but it's also not as relevant to the sci-fi genre, when it no longer truly fits it. Should you watch it? Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a decent film with some great performances and worth checking out.
Do you know anything about hearts?
Yeah, a little.
Yeah.
This next one is a bit of an odd one, and it debuted on September 11th in a Polish film festival, and it's The War of the Worlds Next Century. It then played sometime in October in Chicago at a film festival, but didn't get a regular release until February of 1983 in Poland. We find out that around the end of the century, Earth was contacted by aliens from Mars with the intention of helping to advance the human race. They're fed information from a propaganda-like news program, although the anchor, Iron Edem, hates simply reading off stock scripts. The next day, he's visited by an aggressive police squad that destroy his house and kidnap his wife. Suddenly, his station is running blood drives, and it seems as if the Martians aren't as friendly as everyone is making out. It soon becomes apparent that the state is working with the Martians and hiding their nefarious intentions and fooling the general public. Edem buckles under the pressure and goes along with his state messaging, but one night he ends up in a shelter kind of place that turns out to be some sort of concentration camp, and he sees how willing people are to simply obey the orders and not question when the police start doing things considered extremely abusive. He finally reaches his breaking point and realizes that fighting back is the only option, but turning the tide of public perception isn't easy when people are so resistant to change, so he faces an uphill battle. And this is from Piotr Szolkin, a Polish director who mainly did work in his home country, and he passed back in 2018, but spent most of his earlier life in film, and then switched to becoming a film school professor in the latter half of his life. And remember how I said that this film played in 1981, but then didn't get a regular release until 2 years later? Well, that's because it was banned. You see, as you can probably tell by the title, this was his take on the H.G. Wells novel War of the Worlds, but he wanted a more modern, subversive take on the subject. So, he constructed this tale, making it a critique of totalitarianism and television as a source of propaganda. But the problem was, at this particular time in Poland, there was a big government turmoil, leading to General Jaruzelski declaring martial law in the country, locking it down. This film, seen as a critique of the very thing that was occurring, was immediately banned and wouldn't be allowed to be released until the state of emergency was lifted in 1983. And I'm giving this one 4 tapes. It's a bit on the slow side and maybe takes too long to get going, but it's a powerful message, a captivating story that has probably more resonance today than it did then. The sad part is the people that need to see this the most will likely see the propaganda machine as the opposite side of the political spectrum from themselves. Its significance is lower though, at a 2, since it's not really all that known, but still has a bit of historical impact. Should you watch it? Yeah, just don't expect Tom Cruise running away from fireballs.
Prawda może być tylko jedna!
Nie.
Niech pan powtórzy ostatnią kwestię. Chcemy to mieć w innym planie.
Powiedziałem nie!
Moving into October now, and on the 15th in Australia, we're checking out Center Spread. Based on the title, you're gonna assume that it's about nude photography, and sure enough, it begins with a shoot involving a bald couple, breasts, blades, and it's a solid 8 minutes into the film before you can even figure out what the hell is going on. It's set in the future, and Gerard here is a fashion photographer, but the shoots are all kinda surreal. But it seems like his publishers are now looking for someone with a new look to spice things up. He goes out and about and happens to run into Nikki working at a shop, and she's played by Kylie Foster, one of her earliest roles, and she's not really known here, but has consistently been on Australian productions. There's then more photo shoots that are increasingly strange, and there's several moments in which the film sort of dances around just becoming standard porn, with very long leering shots of body parts that I think are supposed to represent like what the photographer is capturing and his primary interest, but then it's also just kind of like, here's some boobs. There's a particularly cool one using body paints, and Gerard entices Nikki into his world. And Tony Patterson is the director on this one, but it was the only film in which he took that role. Most of his filmography consists of editing work, and he cut some pretty solid flicks, mostly Australian, and did the original Mad Max. This came out right in the middle of the whole Ozploitation thing, although this one had a bit more emphasis on the ploitation part of things. The budget is apparently disputed since there's reports that it cost $600,000, but that seems unlikely. The production studio at the time said that they intended to shoot 6 films for $1 million, and this was one of them, so that would put the budget at less than $200K. Then, a later interview with a producer claimed that it was even less than that, and more likely between $125 to $150K. It was shot on 16mm and blown up, which was pretty rare for a film with a budget like this, but it does create that sort of grainier look throughout the film. But it's kind of weird, because the futuristic setting doesn't really come into play that frequently. Like, based on the clothes and the technology and stuff, it's clear that it's meant to be in the future, but you could just as easily have set this in the present day, and not much would change. There's really not much plot to speak of. It's literally just a series of photo shoots in odd surroundings as Gerard's work becomes less violent and aggressive and more about romance and love. It got pretty terrible reviews when it came out, even being called atrocious in local newspapers. And I wouldn't say it's atrocious, but I'm only giving it 1.5 tapes since there's just nothing to it. There's a nugget of an interesting story with the photographer toning his works down through his romantic attachment, but it's lost in the pointlessly long, softcore kind of stuff. Its significance is only a 1 since it's practically completely unknown, has no notable names, and no real impact on the genre. Should you watch it? It's a pass.
She's the one.
Then on October 30th, one day before Halloween, a non-horror flick was released in the form of one of the most prophetic films, Looker.
She's a looker, that's what they say.
It has the Big Fish as a plastic surgeon who is asked to perform surgery on a stunning commercial actress based upon specifications that she's been given for perfection. Shortly after, though, there's someone in her apartment and bright flashes that seem to disorient her, and she falls from her balcony. Doc Roberts then sees a partridge, and it turns out that 2 of his former patients are dead, with objects placed in their apartments to make him look like a suspect. Another patient who warns him about a conspiracy killing the perfect girls is then killed in a spectacular stunt, so he starts to investigate, which leads him to one of the Magnificent Seven. He starts to tag along with Cindy since she's the likely next target, which brings him face to face with Bernie Lomax, and we find out that this company is scanning the models into their computers, where they can then reproduce their likeness and pay them $200,000 per year, but then they're killing them. The doc's search is blocked by Mustache Man, and I love that that's his actual credit in the movie. He's listed as Mustache Man, but he's also armed with the Looker gun, the source of those bright flashes. When you get zapped by it, you go into a sort of a trance, making you lose track of time. And the director on this one, as well as the writer, is none other than Michael Crichton, author of a huge string of successful novels, including the Jurassic Park series, the Andromeda Strain, and like 100 other things that movies have been made out of. Like, seriously though, out of his 28 novels, half have been made into feature films, which is probably a lower ratio than Stephen King, but probably have a higher box office total. Before this, he had done the original Westworld, Coma, and The Great Train Robbery, all of which he also wrote the screenplays for. At the time, it featured the first ever use of a CGI human character, although it's not necessarily used as an effect here, and more just showing the scanning of Cindy. So in this case, the digital character is meant to be a digital character instead of convincing you it's real. The weirdest thing is just how accurately this film predicted something that is going on right now. Currently, the industry is extremely concerned about the studios wanting to use AI to replicate and recreate actors from their scanned likenesses, only without paying them $200,000 a year like in this movie. This film predicted a world where corporations would find living actors disposable once they were able to recreate their images over 40 years before it actually happened. One actor that wasn't happy with being replaced, or at least deleted, was James Coburn, who complained that a large number of his scenes ended up on the cutting room floor and expanded the story of the film and improved it. From what I can tell, it's mainly one scene, but it's pretty long, and it's basically one of those villain shows up to explain his evil plan things and then leaves the heroes in a scenario that they can easily escape. I could see why it was cut, but it does tie up a couple of loose ends in the overall story. It was a fairly pricey picture, with people stating it cost anywhere from $8 to $12 million, but flopped at the box office, bringing in a mere $3 million. And my rating on it is a 4, since I have some strong nostalgia for this one. I think that there's some interesting concepts going on here between the CG replacements and looker guns, even if the movie doesn't totally live up to its own promise. Its significance is a 3.5, since it was a failure at the time and only reached people through constant cable runs, but it had Crichton at the wheel, a great cast, and is more relevant today than ever. Should you watch it? Yeah, give it a look.
Hi, I'm Cindy. I'm the perfect female type, 18 to 25. I'm here to sell for you. Hi, I'm Cindy. I'm the perfect female type, 18 to 25. I'm here to sell for you. Hi, I'm Cindy. I'm the perfect female type, 18 to 25. I'm here to sell for you.
On that same day, another interesting curiosity arrived in the form of a sort of sequel that everyone wanted, just maybe not like this, and it's Shock Treatment. And this is a weird one. There's this town, Denton, and the whole place is a TV studio, and if you live here, you're either on the show, work on one, or are an audience member. There's a couple here that aren't that happy about living there, and it's Jessica Harper from Suspiria and this guy from, everything. Their names are Brad and Janet, and if that's familiar, Brad and Janet from Denton, then you've seen the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and we'll get back to that in a minute. Well, B and J are pretty unhappy together, and their marriage is on the rocks, and they're chosen to participate on the show, a game show called Marriage Maze. Because of it, they are sent off to other shows, with Brad being sent to Dentonvale, which features one of the Dangerous brothers, who I said in the American Werewolf recap in the Horror 80s Project played Vim Fuego when he was clearly playing Colin Gregson. Guess I bottomed out there. At Dentonvale, there's a brother and sister doctor combo, and it's Riff Raff and Magenta, another link to Rocky Horror, although important to note that Brad and Janet don't recognize them as such. And oh, by the way, the host is played by Barry Humphries, who passed away very recently, and you probably know more as Dame Edna. And yeah, the obvious. This was intended as a follow-up to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, with Jim Sharman coming back to direct and Richard O'Brien once again writing and starring. But it's a strange combo of returning actors playing new characters and returning characters played by new actors. Seems that Susan Sarandon wanted more money than they could afford, and Barry Bostock wasn't available, so Harper and DeYoung were brought on board to fill their roles. The only person from Rocky to play the same character was Jeremy Newson as Ralph Hapshat, although his character seems different. So, because of these casting quirks and character differences, some don't actually consider this a sequel and can be seen either way. Like, while there is continuity there, there's enough wiggle room that it doesn't really have to be either. And you know, for how beloved that Rocky Horror was, this one was met with one hell of a backlash. Fans were pretty angry that none of the lead actors returned, particularly Tim Curry, and hated that O'Brien refused to peg down exactly what the film was. The pre-hype for the film told people that it wasn't a sequel, wasn't a prequel, but was an equal, which didn't really tell them much. Critics didn't care much for it either, with most of the appreciation going towards the songs and the set design, but saying that the story was garbage. O'Brien agreed, later on referring to the movie as an abortion. And look, Rocky Horror was considered a flop when it came out, and then slowly built up its audience through midnight screenings. So this one was never given a regular release and only went to the midnight circuit. Since the budget here compared to Rocky was double, the stakes were higher, but the audiences didn't show up, and it vanished pretty quickly. And this might be controversial, but this is only a 3 for me. It's just too all over the place and never really knows what it wants to be. It looks great, and the music is killer, but there's just nothing to get into story-wise. Its significance is a 2.5 since it's still pretty unseen, even though it's a sequel of sorts to a huge phenomenon. Its significance is a little higher now since the underlying themes seemed to predict reality TV and TV obsessiveness, which is ironic since this came out on the same day as Looker, which plumbed the same depths. Should you watch it? Sure, I know a lot out there that have a higher opinion of this one than me, so you may be one of them.
Bitching in the kitchen or crying in the bedroom all night.
A few days later, on November 6th, a film that I absolutely adore came out, and we're going to take a look at Time Bandits. And this episode may go long because I have a lot to say about this one. We meet little Kevin, who is obsessed with reading about history while his parents can't stop watching TV. And geez, with these last 3 movies, are we noticing a theme here? The TV presenter is mainly interested in the greater good. The greater good. And that night, a knight on horseback bursts through Kevin's room. The next night, he's ready for it, but instead, a group of little people come through, led by Randall, played by the brilliant David Rappaport. And look, I'm not trying to start this off on a down note or anything, but I find this depressing because of this group of actors right here. The only one remains alive. They're being pursued by a giant floating head looking for a map, but they escape into Napoleonic France. They do so with a map of time that they say was stolen from the Supreme Being. And I know that Napoleon has a reputation for being short, but who knew that he was a hobbit? And the director here was Terry Gilliam, Monty Python alumni, and he had recently kind of struck out on his own as an artist. He was most known for doing those crazy animations in the episode, and he was trying to find funding for his pet project, Brazil. Unable to do that, he was able to get money from none other than George Harrison, who funded this as a family film. which I guess his fellow Pythoner Michael Palin co-wrote the screenplay, and they set about their tale, which also featured Palin along with Olive Oil, and it's got John Cleese and my absolute favorite joke.
And you're a robber too, are you? How long have you been a robber?
4'1".
Good Lord. Jolly good. 4'1".
Yes.
Well, that is a long time, isn't it?
It's also got the amazing David Warner as the villainous Evil.
So he can't be totally... Never talk to me like that again.
Zardoz himself as King Agamemnon, but you also have Mona as an ogre's wife on this ship, and man, do I have a story about this ship. You see, the boat they're on is a replica of a Spanish galleon, built by a father-son team in the 60s into the 70s. It was used in the movies, and afterwards they changed the name of the boat to the Time Bandit. It gave tours in Newport Beach for a while, but then was purchased and sent to Big Bear Lake as a tour boat, where I got to ride it. And here's a picture of Christy on the boat. Problem is, the tour guide mentioned that it was in the movie, and then called Time Bandits a terrible movie, one of the worst movies of all time, which A, greatly reduced his tip, and B, made me doubt every single other thing that he told me on the tour. I mean, if he could be so blatantly wrong about that, how can I trust any of his other so-called facts? After all, it was critically acclaimed at the time and still holds a solid 90% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes and did quite well in ticket sales. It only cost $5 million, which is insane when you look at it. This film looks considerably more expensive, and it's crazy to compare to Looker, which I mentioned ran around like 12 million bucks, and this was made for less than half of that. I mean, look at these nightmare-inducing horsehead monsters. Gaze on these giant Lego pieces and know how well they spent that budget to make this look this good. But when it was released, it went to #1 and eventually grossed $36 million, making it a certified hit. For a while, there was an attempt to make a sequel back in 1996 and would have featured the original cast. But by then, both David Rappaport and Tiny Ross had died, and when Jack Purvis passed away while they were in the planning stages, they decided to set it aside. In the near future, look for a new TV series version from Taika Waititi for Apple Plus, and it's been brewing since around 2018. Gilliam came on board as an executive producer, and the series is set for a 10-episode run, with Lisa Kudrow and Charlene Yee involved, although it does seem like the bandits won't necessarily all be little people in this version. And I'm giving this one a 5. This is one of the greats for me because I don't just view this as a fun film. I think it's extremely well made and oddly philosophical. I don't want to spoil the ending, but the amount of existential dread that it's giving me is insane considering that this is a friggin' kids movie. Its significance is a 4 since I think it's a pretty influential work with a laundry list of names attached, the Monty Python connection, but it's just never reached the massive blockbuster status that I would hope it would to get it higher. Should you watch it? Of course. It's about time.
Oh, Benson. Dear Benson, you are so mercifully free of the ravages of intelligence.
You say such nice things, Master.
Yes, I know, I'm sorry.
So there you have it, getting into the later half of the year of 1981 for Sci-Fi. There will be a third episode of this coming in the near future to round out the year. And also the ending of the horror project for 1981 is getting close as well, too. Getting ready to move on to 1982. Out of this block, it's very clear that my favorite movie is Time Bandits. It may end up being my favorite sci-fi film of this year. I guess we'll find out when we get there. It's a great one. Let me know what your favorite is in this block. Tell me down below in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. If you like what you see, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell to get notified when new videos come out. And if you think about it, go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines. You can help support the project, keep getting more episodes done, and keep checking back. And we'll see you very shortly because we're going to continue on with the 80s project.